Good morning. It is Monday, October 20th. Welcome to the Transportation and Environment Committee. Today we have one item on our agenda, and that is Bill 2425, Transportation Demand Management Repeal. Bill 2425 would repeal Article 2 of Chapter 42A of the Montgomery County Code and amend the law governing transportation demand management in the county. Transportation demand management dates back to the creation of the Silver Spring Transportation Management District in the mid-1980s, when employers in Montgomery County's transportation management districts were required to submit transportation mitigation plans. And then back in 2006, the council created a system for transportation management fees, district fees, and requirements for certain employers, also expanding those requirements to new buildings. Then in December 2019, the council passed Bill 3618, Transportation Demand Management Plan Amendments, with which Executive Regulation 821 was developed to implement. The goal of Bill 3618 back then was to streamline and expand transportation management district requirements through the county to better ensure progress toward the county's goals to reduce single occupancy vehicle trips. It also expanded the number of employers required to complete transportation management district plans. And here we are, 5 years later. A lot has happened since, including a global pandemic, a shift to workers remotely, another shift to hybrid work models, and an ongoing push to update the growth and infrastructure policy areas. I want to thank Councilmember Balcom for introducing this bill to meet the moment of today and for her efforts to streamline TDM in general, even before she got to the council. And so with that, I will turn it over to Councilmember Balcom.
Okay, thank you. Thank you all for being here. It's been a long journey, not only the transportation demand management process, but this looking at how we're going to move forward. So as Chair Glass mentioned, this started, the genesis of this specific bill started when we got the regs for the bill that was passed in 2019. We didn't get those until early 2024. And when I reviewed the regulations, there were a lot of concerns about the effectiveness of not only the regulations, but the bill itself. And so the initial look at the regulations were to modify the regulation, but a lot of the issues actually went back to the bill. And so it required legislation, and the initial thought was to revise the existing legislation. But as we went further and further, it, to me, became apparent that we needed to repeal this law. Partially because of the increasing complexity of how the law was to be implemented, the expansion of the law, but also the issue of how telework was so ingrained in our non-auto driver mode share goals. And so when we looked at the latest metrics for where we stood on those goals, we far surpassed all the goals because of the interplay with telework. And so that certainly played into it. But also, in the meantime, the county's Inspector General conducted an audit, the second audit of employer requirements of the TDM program, which is a small piece, but an important piece, and reported that there was inadequate oversight of the compliance of the employer portion. That similar audit done in 2016 and 2016 had similar results. And an additional factor is we are currently looking at impact taxes and transportation impact tax. And I understand, clearly there is a separate TDM fee and impact taxes, But when you look at the underlying reason for both of those is the impact that a building has on traffic and transportation. For that reason, I introduced a full repeal of the law. That is what's very important to say, is that the repeal of the law does not diminish the purpose, the underlying purpose of transportation demand management. The county absolutely should have non-auto driver mode share goals. Those goals are woven into many things we do. Our growth and infrastructure policy, as well as many master plans, have the non-auto driver mode share goals, and we want that to continue. We need to continue to encourage residents to walk, bike, or take transit to reduce single occupancy vehicles. We should absolutely have close contact with employers. Employers are instrumental in letting their employees know what kind of services are available, what kind of incentives are available through various incentive packages. And we should work with our developers to come up with ways to build our communities to reduce reliance on single occupancy vehicles. All of that can be done without the existing TDM law. Repealing the TDM law does not, none of those things go away. Because the TDM program is so complicated, there are several issues in the packet that we're going to need to go through, in particular, what to do with the existing plans, and we'll go through that as we go through the packet. We're here to talk about it today. It's been a long time. I appreciate my colleagues in signing on to the bill, and for everyone's patience in working through this. Special thanks, Ms. McCartney Green. This was very complicated. I so appreciate you helping to walk through this. Certainly, DOT planning is here today. So this has been very involved legislation with many, many conversations. So I appreciate that.
Thank you, Councilmember Balcom. I appreciate again, your work to help streamline this, and your comments specifically regarding the noteworthy, notable goal that we all agree with, but trying to figure out another way of accomplishing it without putting additional burden on some of our property owners and our employers. So thank you. With that, Ms. McCartney Green, turn it over to you.
Thank you, and good morning, Chair Glass and committee members. That was a full introduction, so I won't go through the intro. I will turn to our summary of our public hearing that we had. We did have 3 speakers that testified. We had representatives from the private sector and Suburban Hospital that strongly expressed support to repeal the TDM law and testified that the existing requirements were outdated and overly burdensome as well. We also had, obviously, representatives from the executive side that talked about potential negative impacts, and the county executive did send over a memo as well laying out some of the concerns that he has. In addition, Planning Board sent in a letter as well expressing its support for the TDM initiatives. With the summary of the impact statements, racial equity, climate assessment, and economic impacts, so that there was not enough information to determine the accurate assessment of the bill, and that the fiscal impact, the total net loss to the county revenue would be $6 million over 6 years. With that said, the way how the packet, the issues for discussions, the first 3 points, and I'm on page 5 of the staff report, really speak to just the overall general parts of the program. If repealed, what would the funding, how would that impact funding? Number 2, talking about the enforcement activities and imposition of fines. I know that was one of the discussion points that came up during the audit committee that was held earlier this month. And then whether DOT had discussions about what a modified legislation would look like. Chair, we could take those in as a bulk, as a general overview, but council staff does want to have a larger discussion on point number 4, talking about the termination of the plans and the agreements.
I agree with the process, and so if you want to walk us through.
Sure. And so, like I said, generally, number one is how would funding be impacted if the TDM law is repealed? Just thinking about where those fees would go and what that would look like. Not sure if DOT wanted to speak on that or had any additional comments in addition to what the fiscal impact statements say.
Welcome, Director.
Good morning. Thank you, and appreciate the conversations we'd have up till now and now as well. Obviously, $1 million out of a relatively small program is a big impact to that program's budget. So the TDM program is supported, and correct me if I get it wrong, but roughly 1/4 is generated by these fees. And those fees are used principally to fund the activities of outreach contractors and county staff that are working with employers in the established transportation management districts. So it is not really advancing expansion of transportation demand management in the county, but is working in the long-established transportation management districts, so North Bethesda, Bethesda, Silver Spring, White Oak, Friendship Heights, and Shady Grove, is where those activities are occurring now, and those have been established for a while. The newest of those is the White Oak TMD, which was established several years ago, but has only been active for the last few years. So that's about a 25% impact to our ability to meet the programming demands in those districts.
I'm Haley Peckett, Deputy Director. And just to add, we went through a budgeting exercise recently, and so likely the outreach contracts, which do quite a bit of outreach as well as technical assistance, in most of them are based to go to each TMD. So we'd probably be looking at not a straight 25% cut necessarily to those, but maybe 25 to 50% depending on the contract with the reduction in fees because of the way we have certain other fixed costs in the management of the program.
Thank you for shedding light as to what the budgetary impact would be with the reduction of these fees. What I'd like you to expand upon a little bit more is what those programs actually are, right? So 25 to 50% reduction, what does that mean? What are the programs that are currently underway?
Absolutely. So our outreach contracts are structured a little bit differently, but we've got several outreach contracts that work with one specific TMD, so one contract per TMD, others that cross multiple, and then we have a countywide. They cover a number of different tasks, but most of the funding goes towards people that work in marketing and outreach, and they form relationships with employers and property managers of multifamily residential. So they'll have a number of touch points. It could be a one-on-one meeting. It could be regular phone calls. It's a lot of events and information sessions at what they know to be the great touch points within that TMD. So if there's a big event in Bethesda, if there's a big event or a committee in White Oak, they'll know to be at that or to work specifically. They know when there's a new employer that's opening or a major employer that's changing, they can go and have a touch point with that employer. And when they have these meetings and conversations, they could be working specifically on your TDM plan to say, hey, you're a new employer. Do you know that there's these transit routes or that there's these are some of the ways that you may be able to encourage your employers, or tell us more about your employees and their work commutes. Are they 9 to 5? Are they working, retail shifts that may be different hours, and be able to tailor some of the TDM strategies to them. They could also be doing general awareness, and there's a host of programs that they are required to cover. So it could include things like the rideshare program, fair share benefits, so transit benefit programs. It includes a lot of so council of government related programs, and Sandy will jump in if I'm missing some things here. It does include telework. It does include van pool and carpool matching. So there's a number of things that they will cover as part of that, so that they're educating the employees and the residents about many benefits, some of which are related to the TDM plans required, and some are just the general outreach and awareness.
Thank you for that. I applaud the goal, right, which is information dissemination. I'm not quite sure, and the reason I signed on to this, and the reason I had concerns when the underlying bill 3618 went through this committee back in my first term, and I actually voted against it at the committee level. because I wasn't quite sure that this was a function that the county needed to lead on. And I reflect on my own experience living in downtown Silver Spring for in an apartment or condo for about 15 years. And then traveling, actually working in Virginia and in Washington, D.C. And the way that I and so many other coworkers over the years figure out the best way to get to work is by figuring out what works and what doesn't. Figuring out what those bus routes are, what those walking routes are, where the parking and other transportation nodes might be. And I also try to I've also been reflecting right now on the fact that while we have this type of outreach, it was earlier in this year when we, through the budget, approved fare-free buses, and there was a request for hundreds of thousands of dollars to promote fare-free buses as another informational aspect to commuters. And all of this is tax dollars or fees that are going towards information that I think people have readily accessible to them, or that they will figure out through trial and error. And so, again, I applaud the goal, and we do want to make sure that people are able to safely commute around the region to get to work, but I think they will figure that out through conversation and through personal experience as well. Oh, yes. Councilmember Stewart.
Thank you. Thank you for the update, and I agree with what the remarks of the chair right now. And I'll say, just for the record, I also agree with the goal and what we're trying to go towards, but what we're trying to do is figure out the best way there. I guess one of the questions I have, and if you don't have that information today, as we continue these conversations, it would be helpful to know how many of these contracts we have, and when the last time the contracts were reviewed. And is this the same, like, when you talk about the outreach, because, I clearly have seen, DOT ride on in many different events. And in fact, I think I sent you all a note after the ag fair. Like, I think that your booth there was probably the one that had the longest lines, and the staff are amazing. But when I see them out there, I'm always thinking those are DOT staff. And I guess I'm just trying to figure out who's doing this outreach, because I have to say, we have a lot of events in downtown Silver Spring, and I'm not sure I've seen these folks. And I just don't know if I'm missing them or if they're part of this outreach.
Sure. Well, let me start, and then Sandy will jump in on the specifics. Yeah. So there's one outreach contract for Bethesda Urban Partners, one for TAP, Transportation Alternatives, which is North Bethesda. There's a marketing and outreach contract that covers the other 4 TMDs. So that's correct. And then there's a countywide contract. And at least when I go out to events, so like the county executives budget forums, there were outreach contractors, not necessarily DOT staff at those outreach tables. And it depends on the event. Like Taste of Bethesda, I believe, had like outreach bike to work day, for example. There were everybody, but there was a lot, especially like some of the TMDs, the outreach contractors run it themselves, the ones with the larger budgets. And I do want to just note one thing that Chair Glass said, which is we recently did a survey, our Title VI survey for Ride On, and found that like a third of our riders turn over every 3 years. So it's a lot of new people that are coming in. So there isn't necessarily this idea that everybody just knows that everything exists. We do a lot of outreach, and there's transit outreach, and there's this transportation demand management outreach, and to some degree we do have outreach through individual projects and programs. We have Vision Zero and Safe Routes to School outreach, and there's a lot of coordination. So these people don't all show up at the same event and say like, we're all here, we don't know what we're doing. There is coordination to make sure these happen. But really being at the employer level where you can say, hey, we have a bike room at our work and showers, and we have a policy that allows people to like leave their bikes overnight in case it's raining or not. Like that type of thing makes a difference as to whether someone bikes or not. And if you don't reach the employer to create those policies and help them understand what the latest and greatest of those policies and benefits that are offered at the regional level are, then their employees won't take advantage of it because it's probably not on the top of the mind of the property managers and employers. And Sandy, is there anything I missed there?
Sandy Bracker from Commuter Services. One thing I want to stress is that with these contractors, we have emphasized to them they are representing us. They are representing the county. So they wouldn't necessarily be identified as, other people or whatever. At least that's supposed to be the way it is. We do try to have enough staff to attend most of the major events. So we do, about Bike to Work Day. We do Green Fest. We do Car Free Day. We do Bike to Work Day. We do a lot of different events in a lot of different places, focusing primarily on the TMDs. We did end up more recently getting a contract to do the other areas of the county, including the up-county areas, as well as Wheaton, which are not TMDs. And as far as, let's see, what was I going to say about the types of information? First of all, I want to emphasize, it's unusual, Councilmember Glass, to live in one place in this county for 15 years. People are constantly changing and to have the same work site. Even if you stay with the same employer, employers move, residential locations move. What we're trying to do is address the changes that are constantly occurring in our environment. So it has to do with both residential locations, work site locations, policies, programs. I would ask the question, do you know what the upcoming calendar year maximum transit benefit is, tax-free? Most people don't yet. So that's the type of information that we would be providing. And by the way, it's going to be $345 a month. So one of our tasks is to try to make employers and residents aware of these different types of programs. In addition to Fair Share, we have a regional program, Smart Benefits, where employers can sign on to have pre-tax payroll deduction, which is pre-tax for them, benefits the employee. As well as, direct benefits, which really have a tremendous impact on how people choose. All the research has shown having a direct benefit makes a big difference. Recruitment and retention of employees is one of the key factors for employers to be able to save money. Turnover costs a lot for an employer. So the ability to resolve one of the key issues why people leave a job or they don't take a certain job is the commute. And so one of the things that we're trying to work with the employer to understand and to implement is policies that support recruitment and retention through the transportation end. We're not saying it solves all those problems, but those are the types of things that and likewise from the residential end, a lot of times employers might not think that would make a difference to their employees. But if we go to the employees, they say it does. And so we're trying to also build demand or responsiveness from the ground up with the employees as well as from the top down with the employer policies. And so that's the messaging that we're using and going out to these broader events. That's one of the ways we're getting those messages out. And they're much more personalized than just generic, here's what's going on out there. A lot of people do not pay attention to just generic messaging. But if you're talking about their own commute and their own issues and the employer's own issues, it really resonates in a different way.
Just as a follow-up, thank you for elaborating on that. And I think as we're going through this, it would just be helpful to, a lot is good to know, but to quantify that, to know like how many employers have they connected with, how many events, and other things. Whatever reporting the contractors must do under the contract, sharing that information with the committee, I think would be helpful. And I don't want to belabor this because this is regarding the repeal bill, but are they also connecting with our local chambers?
Absolutely.
Yes.
We have chamber members on our advisory committees for every TMD. I also want to mention we did do some analysis. I don't have the total number of events in front of me, but I can tell you that we had overall had 250,000 contacts with people throughout FY25, which is the figures I drew out. But we could come back about the total number of events. I don't have that. But we did reach about 85,000 businesses, as well as a number of residents, through all the other types of events.
Great. I think that would be very helpful, going back to what the chair started talking about. A range between a 25 to 50% budget cut is pretty broad, and understanding what are they doing now and what are we looking at would be helpful. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for those comments and questions. And I'll reflect on this conversation, which is what this whole work session is, right? Trying to figure out what this balance is. And I absolutely agree with the fact that employers want their employees to know how to safely get to work, how to commute. Property owners want to make sure that they're either renters or owners within their units have the ability to commute around the region. And I also know that those employees and those residents are actively figuring it out, and that's why they've chosen to work at a certain location. Some people reject employment opportunities because the commute is bad. Some people chose not to live in a certain community because the transportation is bad for their personal commute. I don't necessarily think that the employer or the property manager needs to work with the county government to convey that information to the employee or to the resident who is already making value-based, economic-based decisions on that information, which is readily available, not only with their own eyes, but with plenty of apps that are available right now. And so, again, the information is important, the goal is important, it's just how we get there. And the last thing I'll say before turning it back over to Councilmember Balcom, the best way to ensure that residents and employees have an ease of travel is by making travel easier. And that is why we have put so much focus on bus rapid transit, on our transportation network, on safe streets with bike lanes and sidewalks, and other Vision Zero goals. When people see those programs and those infrastructure projects being built, that is the best indicator of how they will choose to commute. And so I'll turn it over to Councilmember Balcom.
Thank you. So I appreciate everything that contractors do. I've had meetings with several of the contractors. I've offered to meet with all of them. A couple of them have taken me up on it. So the information is great, but two important points, in my opinion. One is there is a disconnect between the fee. The fee is paid by the developer, and the activity that's taking place at the employer level in the transportation management districts. There's a disconnect between who is paying the fee and who is getting the service, because the developer pays the fee based on the project. The employer gets the benefit of the information and the activity. So who is ultimately responsible for paying for this activity? So I don't think that we should ask our developers to pay a fee to fund this particular activity. That's one aspect. The other aspect is, and I understand that depending on where the building is, that there may be a direct connection between the developer who pays the fee, because you're going to be working with employers in that particular building, in that particular project. But there's not a one-to-one connection there. So that's one issue. And then the other issue is that this is a 25% decrease in the budget, but there will be activity that you no longer have to do. All the compliance work that you currently do, the survey work that you currently do, won't be done anymore. And so in the fiscal analysis, I'm not sure whether there was looked at the net impact, right? Because there will be activity that legitimately is no longer done. And then you can focus on activities that are most impactful and most effective. So those are just my 2 points on that.
Just a couple of points to highlight in terms of the applicability of the fee. I don't disagree with the way you characterized it, that there's a certain group of people who are subject to this fee, and those are not the same people who necessarily benefit from the program. My understanding of the rationale for that was that people who were opting to develop after a certain date were agreeing to that fee. There have been discussions in the past about making that fee lower and more uniform in these transportation management districts. So I think your assessment of that is indeed accurate. In terms of the budgeting without some of the administrative requirements, obviously we haven't developed our budget without these revenues, and that would be something that would follow the council's action here. But I think you are right that there is some shifting between administrative functions and outreach functions, and that's something we would have to work through once those revenue impacts are clear and determined. And I just wanted to make the point about people's own choice of travel behavior. I have a great deal of respect for everybody in this room and think perhaps you are all a little bit more analytical than our average resident or employee in the county, and probably take more time to figure out the choice that's best for you rather than the choice that's habitual for you. As an example, I commute here to Rockville, and I have 4 or 5 options that the travel time varies within a few minutes, and I use all of them, but if I weren't thinking about it because of what I do, I'm not sure I would consider that. I think I'd probably do the same thing every day. And I just want to point out that I think we all, given our work in this space, probably give this a little bit more thought on a daily basis than those who are just living their lives, and transportation is a necessary but unloved component of their lives.
Can I just, oh, I'm sorry.
Oh, okay. I was going to quickly just draw out an example that I briefly mentioned before. If I'm an outreach contractor and I go and meet with Acme Corporation and I'm giving them specific guidance or reaching out to them about enforcement of their TDM plan, and we can get into this in a separate conversation, we've really focused on relationships and not a stick-based enforcement. So for us, what enforcement has looked like through the outreach contractor is sitting down with Acme a few times a year and saying, let's talk about your TDM plan. What are the strategies? And while we do it, we'll also say, hey, here's all of these, all those host of things. It's all kind of one conversation in one meeting. So it is not a strict, like, we spend 1 hour with an employer twice a year, and now that we no longer have the enforcement, we will no longer spend that hour. We still need to spend that hour. We just will, maybe it's only 45 minutes because we're not walking through the plan, but we're still educating on other things. So the scale of how we do that budgeting, when we have tried to look at that, it's not exactly as efficient as you might be able to say, because there's a lot that happens in those conversations.
And I just wanted to make a couple of quick points. One is that, yes, we may not be required to do the survey, but we may still want and probably will want to have some sort of information along those same lines. The survey, interestingly, started out before I was with the county as a marketing survey. It was never intended originally to be a way to measure non-auto driver mode share. It evolved into that role, I think, because of not having other information sources, perhaps, that would address non-auto driver mode share, which is a kind of unique metric to our county. But in addition, we would still want to have the option to collect information on a broader basis in some other way. We agree that the survey may not be the best way, the way we're doing it now. The other point I wanted to make is, by virtue of not having requirements, we expect that it's going to be a harder sell to get access to employers to discuss some of these things, not easier and less time consuming. We have experience about that because prior to 2002, when that requirement came into effect, we used to frequently, and I think we've made this point in discussions, Councilmember Balcom, we frequently were turned away by employers and just said, we're not interested, we don't need that information, we don't want it. And in fact, denied access, even told to scram from in front of someone's building if we were having an event. And some of these were very major employers, by the way. So we do think that it will be a bigger task without the requirements. Granted, we haven't been enforcing, but having the authority through the law to say, if you have X number of employees, then you really do need to at least have a talk with us, have us be able to show you some of these options, et cetera. You'd be surprised how many employers know absolutely nothing about the options, and being able to do that. And the last comment I wanted to make alongside what Chris is saying is about people not attending to some of these things. I can't tell you how many times we've been at outreach events and someone will come over to our table and say, well, what's this about? And we'll tell them, and they say, well, I don't commute, I drive to work. Seriously.
I know it. Agreed. Ms. McCartney Green, so we're
That takes us
continuing this conversation. Yes. The decision point, I know you've put forward a number of topics to talk through. Is there a particular decision point that you're asking us to make at this point?
Yeah, at page 6, number 4, concerning the termination of transportation mitigation agreements and the TDM plans. I can walk the committee through that.
Please do that.
Sure, and so this is probably the more complex part of the, do we want to go back to?
Yeah.
Councilmember Bach.
I didn't know, Chair Glass, if you meant, is there a decision point on number 1 or a
That's-
decision point overall?
No,
Okay.
number 1. Thank
Right.
you. Thank you for
Okay.
clarifying.
Sorry,
Yeah,
going
yeah.
back, it was just a discussion point.
Fair
There is
point.
no decision point under number 1. Number 2 and 3 is also discussion points as well. So we can talk through that as well and go through.
Do you want to lead us off?
So, yes, and number 2, the important point, we talked about this at the audit committee, and the DOT is looking at implementing fines for employers who are not compliant, and I suggested that not happen and what that mechanism would be. So.
Just for clarity on the fines, we're specifically talking about Section 42A32, which talks about if the department sends a notice to an employer who has failed to complete the survey or report required within a certain time, the department has the discretion to apply a Class C violation or fine, and that's in the law it's considered $50. And so that's one of the things to note. And while this law is still in place and effective, that is still the department's discretion to do that.
Again, we did talk about this in the audit committee, but I'm happy to revisit some of it here. The department has not used fines as part of this program. I think we already had some discussion of this, that we've tried to use pliers to convince people rather than a hammer to make them comply, and that's been the way this program has operated. With the OIG's finding that we've been not using the tools available to us and generating the compliance required, we identified a schedule where we would impose fines if the council didn't somehow take other action to make those fines not relevant anymore. And that deadline was put off until, I don't remember when we said December of this year, which may be too soon. We have issued notices to non-compliant employers so far, saying that a fine may be levied, but have not yet moved to impose any fines.
Just to note, there's 2 notices. So the law specifies there's a first notice, and then the second notice. After the second notice, that's when the fine would be. So.
And I think that we had discussed having another series, depending upon what happened further. But yeah, having one more series of notices.
So I would recommend that we not that the county not go forward with any fines until this matter is resolved. It doesn't make sense to fine someone if we're in the middle of legislation that's going to repeal the requirement for compliance.
I agree with that sentiment, and you know, this becomes a chicken or the egg or circular argument to some degree, because there are organizations that are not compliant. We have not fined them. Then the suggestion to fine them into compliance comes up, which gets back to the nature of this program in itself. If it is to help, but that help is not already being provided, yet people are still commuting to work and figuring out their best ways, it raises even more questions. The last thing I would like to do is start fining our employers and residential properties for non-compliance, because again, workers are getting to work, they are figuring it out, regardless of where someone lives and for the time that they live there. The reality is people make these decisions every single day. They are choosing where to live, where to work, and transportation is absolutely a component in that consideration. And yes, they might drive when taking public transportation might be an alternative. And the best way to get them to choose that alternative is to make our public transportation system even better, so that as they talk with their coworkers over coffee or at the water cooler, that is where I think actually the most impactful conversations happen, not from a plaza or an event where people are going there specifically to engage in that type of conversation. I sometimes think that while I love going to bike to work days and going to all these other events, I think that the people who attend that, by and large, are already subscribed. We're preaching to the choir here, and it's everybody else. And the way we change hearts and minds is by making the system better in a positive way, not punitive way. And those conversations happen at the water cooler or smoke break or whatever people choose to do during their time at work. So
I guess the issue is the mechanism. So I am assuming that it's the DOT's discretion as to whether they issue the fines or not.
That's what Ms. McCartney-Green has said.
Yeah.
We did, in our response to the Inspector General, identify that we would lay out a schedule. That schedule was approved by the county executive. My sentiments are not radically different than your own, but we'll have some degree of forbearance, but I'm not sure how long we can hold off complying with the statement of corrective action we've made to the Inspector General.
Hopefully, it won't be long if we can resolve it. So I guess let's talk further, depending on what happens in the next month or so on this legislation.
So just to put a fine point on that, because of the Inspector General report showing noncompliance with the law, or however else we want to describe it, the county executive has instructed the department to start imposing fines in December to comply with the law, as we are taking up this law to get rid of the underlying law. Is that correct?
That's accurate, and it was more than the others were failing. They said we have failed to use the tools available to us. So, and those recommendations to set this fine schedule are many months old now. So it's the passage of time is what's affecting this sort of confluence of the council's consideration of this versus the schedule we outlined, which we thought was going to give ample time for this matter to reach resolution.
And so short of passing this legislation and having it signed into law, which I'm not going to project what the county executive will do, right, given this conversation. But Ms. McCartney-Green, is this the only remedy right now between us and the department moving forward with what the county executive has asked?
Yeah, unfortunately, there's no stay in the law to do that, and we haven't necessarily legally, from a valid point, repealed it, and so we don't have that authority from the legislative branch to put a stay on fines or impositions of that.
Ms. Peckett, did you have something? You're okay? Okay.
No, I guess I appreciate the conversation that's happening, but I also want to note that we had 2 Inspector General reports. This is the second one. So, Ms. Peckett, yeah.
I'm sorry, that actually isn't true.
Oh, it's not? Okay.
Yeah, it was not an OIG report, the
Okay.
first 2016, it was OLO.
OLO, okay,
And it was
thank
an
you.
overview of the entire program. It wasn't just focused on the employer plans and survey results. It was much broader, and actually, to be honest, some of the findings that were cited were not actually what was done, but we don't have to get into that.
Okay, so we have one OLO report, and now we have the Inspector General report. Okay, thank you for clarifying that.
Ms. Malcolm?
So I guess I would ask the department to talk with the county executive to if this is not resolved by December, to defer fines to employers until this is resolved. I know that's a vague statement, but I would hope that we can come to resolution in 2 or 3 months' time.
Thank you. I think we understand the committee's preference on this.
Thank you. Ms. McCartney-Green?
That turns us to our third point, and this was just really a discussion and a proposal for modified legislation, which council staff, through public testimony from the department and the memorandum from the CE, highlighted here. I do want to note that generally the Department of Transportation does have in its overall duties or responsibility the ability to have transportation demand management, and that's just a general provision. And so repealing this legislation today obviously takes away the full force and effect of the law, but generally the department still has that within their purview to have outreach programs and be able to do that. Separately, I do believe the department has another proposal that they may want to discuss, or something that the chair may.
Yeah, thank you so much. And so I think that each of you are familiar with a simple legislation that we have drafted, and the executive has not formally transmitted it, which was the idea of, if we were to try to maintain the most critical elements and kind of pull out a lot of the complexity that Councilmember Balcom noted was problematic from and maybe not aligned with where we are in 2025. So I don't want to go through in a lot of detail, just that we do have a draft that we can work with the executive to submit and to work through, but to note that there's a couple areas that we do think are very important to keep in the code. To one degree, there's just the idea that, like, there is transportation management, there is a value in connecting that program with a specific set of goals that help us to use partnerships. It is not just the county, it is really working with the private sector and with residents to change our travel behavior, and establishing that purpose and those goals in the code. And then I think the most substantial element of our simple legislation is the ability to use TDM plans as a potential condition for development approval. So planning board would have the ability to say, we want you to create a TDM plan. Right now, planning board can say, we want you to build a bike rack, or we want you to include this amount of parking, and those are all very important, but they may say that there are certain programs that cannot be physically built or that need to be included in something that's documented, where DOT works with the developer at the time of development to come up with those plans. We have noted this in our testimony, but there are a number of developments over many decades which these plans or a traffic mitigation agreement was instituted because the developer did not put in other built improvements at the time. And so as we've been working with some of these employers over many decades, as noted, some relationships are stronger and more consistent than others, but they're required as part of their development approval to meet certain conditions, and this is one of them. So nullifying those is something that we think would be inequitable for the peer developer that had to build something physical at the same time. So the simple legislation proposal that we have keeps TDM in the development review phase, which is consistent with what peers around the region do, as well as maintain some of those historic plans. They could be modified and simplified if needed, but allows those to stay valid. We also keep the TDM fees for some of the reasons we expressed before, just in terms of having a user pay program, focusing those on areas that are near our most transit-focused location, which is where we have the most intensive services and we think the most bang for our buck.
Appreciate all of that, and I'm not going to engage further with the ideas that you've put forward until or unless the county executive were to introduce his own bill and legislation, but very much appreciate the thoughtful and constructive approach that you're taking to try and figure out how we move forward. And clearly the tone of this conversation, we are all still trying to figure out how we move forward, recognizing that the underlying legislation does need an update to the year 2025 and beyond. Yeah.
I want to ask a general question, but not for today's conversation, but to sort of think about if the county exec does send over this legislation, the fact that we do have this infrastructure working group that is working now, and we have representatives from the planning department here. I'd like to have a conversation as this proceeds with Ms. Peckett, as you said, the second item, which was having these plans in place when a developer comes versus having them have to build an infrastructure. And how's that working, and what and again, we don't need to get into it now, but the benefits of having those plans versus requiring built infrastructure, particularly since the reason we're here is because this isn't quite working. And so we don't need to get into it today, but Ms. Peck, as you were talking, I think that we should all become prepared at a later time to kind of have that conversation, and in the interim, have that discussion, because I see that there could be a tension there, and I personally want to understand it better.
Can I just note that usually it's both. I don't think there's many instances of like we build nothing and there's a plan only, but often a plan to supplement something that may be built. Thanks.
And I'd just like to make one point. There's some confusion often, and it's not just here, it's in many places, the difference between employers and developers. So, for example, when Deputy Director Peckett was speaking before, she said something about employers. This does not have anything directly to do with employers with regard to the TDM plans for developers, unless that development was one employer. So,
and I think that goes directly to what Councilmember Balcom stated in one of her opening remarks.
Yes, but it's really important to keep separate as you're thinking about it. And so when you said this isn't working, we didn't, the OIG report, et cetera, has not spoken to whether development-based plans, the TDM plans, are not
correct. I guess what I was saying isn't working is the part that we're talking about here, repeal. And I think we're all agreeing, because we don't have employers responding to surveys, that's not really working as we all hope it would.
Agreed. The survey part is true.
Yeah.
So thank you. And yes, the confusion reigns. Yes. Period. of the bill, the last bill, the current law, the regulations, how it's implemented. It's a very, very confusing legislation. So we're going to try to clear that up. So I do think that, and I agree that we're not looking at legislation that hasn't been introduced yet. But the question, and we'll get into this, which really is, to me, the remaining issue that is not resolved yet, is what do we, from the perspective of the developer TDM plans, we have the existing plans, what should be done with the existing plans, and then moving forward, what, if anything, should be required in the future. And so those are two distinctly different things. And then there are also the distinction in the development review process of is the plan used as a conditional approval, which many of them were, not all of them were, but many of them were used as in lieu of built improvements. And so we do need to resolve that. But I think that that's something that we'll take up in the next bullet. And just one last thing, user paid program, I think is important to go back to the comment that I made before. The different users are paying from the people who are getting the service. And so there's the disconnect remains.
Let's keep moving forward.
Brings us to point number 4 on page 6. And let me clear the air and say that the repeal itself is legally valid. And so that's majority of what's in their packet today. It's being bracketed out and removed from the law. The concern that we have here with OCA and looking back at it was the uncodified section. The uncodified section, that's on lines 738 to 756 of the bill. And when I say uncodified means it is a temporary explanation to the department. It is not permanently in code. It is a one-time instructions, and we've done it here all the time where we put the effective date or some type of transition language in there. What's here is, and let me explain that, as introduced, the uncodified section, or section 2, provided a phased out plan. And the phased out plan required notices from the department to send to employers, building owners, and responsible parties that had some of these TDM plans. The issue that we have here and that OCA, Office of County Attorney Office, had raised was that these are three-party agreements. And so the way that it was introduced was a unilateral, like the county would release the land records of these TMAGs. And just to kind of back up a little bit more, TMAGs was pre the 2019 legislation, Bill 3618, and TMAGs required to be signed by the owner, the developer, and by the planning board. And so because it was a three-party agreement, now that if we move forward, the council moves forward in repealing the law, the council could not unilaterally also repeal those agreements that are actually recorded in land records and still run with the property or the developer to date. And so looking this through and thinking of a different alternative, council staff proposed an amendment and also talked to OCA about it. And just for scope, to get the scope, there's about 140 TMAGs and about 13, from my understanding, new development of TDM plans that are out there. So if we're thinking of who this would affect or how many developers would be impacted, that was just general information that I had pulled and put in the packet. So the approach here, the amendment that would be proposed, is shifting the burden from the county to be able to release these TMAGs or these plans, and instead the language on the bottom of page 6 of your packet, it's two parts. It's a notice requirement which says within 60 days after the effective date of this act, the department must provide written notice to each known employer, building owner, responsible party with an existing traffic mitigation agreement or plan, and that the department desires to terminate the agreement. This language is a little bit different because it's not required for the department to initiate it, but instead this will be an open door for the department to cooperate with an owner who says, how can I be released from this? So that's the part A, and then part B talks about a termination request. An employer, building owner, or responsible party is subject to that agreement may request to be released from that, and that would be on a form that's prescribed by the department. So the department would have a form, and if someone says, hey, I'd like to be released from it, part of that form, and it's not here, but released from the county and from planning department to be able to effectuate all three parties. And you may have an owner that says, I don't want to be released. I want to remain in this agreement because maybe it benefits, their department. And so it's transitioning the burden from the county taking that methodical approach as opposed to having a process that is upon request.
I have thoughts. Do you want to go first?
I just want to clarify too that the planning board is not, they don't have to release. So that's
This is
important
true,
to note.
right? Yes.
This seems like a complicated process in itself where we would allow employers and property managers to opt in to opt out, whereby we're asking them, do they want to be in the program or not? And given we already know what the response rates are, we know what some of the participation rates are, I have concerns with this process given the types of communication and level of engagement that we already know about. And I think central to this is, for me, we either do this for everybody or do it for nobody, right? Move forward and stay the status quo and amend and refine the law, or say this is just not workable, or we choose not to have it work this way and make that a blanket approach.
One thing to note is that some of these are really case by case, some of the agreements. And so it was hard to do a blanket approach because each agreement may be a little bit different. There might be some reservation of rights. It becomes very minute on the contractual language that's dated really pre So that was some of the concerns here.
And I know you want to speak. Can I just ask a question real quick? Thank you. No. It as it comes to me, right? So I appreciate what you're saying, and I guess this is a technical question. Are there employers or property managers that lean into this program so much that it is an extension of their own operation?
Again, I want to come back to the distinction between employers and developers. We have
I didn't use the word developer.
I'm sorry, but what I'm saying is, you're saying since we already know what the responses to the survey are, since we already know that, employers don't all do TDM plans, those are employers. We don't have any evidence, shall we say, of how developers and the owners of these buildings feel. So I just want to make that distinction. But there are people, to your question, employers and developers, where they have integrated these programs into, for example, in the TMAGs and the TDM plans, we ask for real-time transit information to be posted. And so many of them have put in transit screens, or they have a listserv where they send this out on their, email, whatever. We have displays of information in some lobbies and things like that. We have, and actually one of the examples I would use is Suburban Hospital. However, I want to note that is not a result of this legislation. That is a result of a special exception process, that whole program, because that Suburban Hospital is not located in a TMD. We have no authority to impose a TDM plan or a traffic mitigation agreement on that property. And so what you heard about their program is great, but it was not a result of this legislation at all. But they are an example of where they have a great display in the lobby so that people coming and going and others can get that information. So yes, there are employers and there are developers where they have leaned into these programs, and developers do benefit in some ways.
Thank you. And I think the Suburban Hospital case study is a point that good employers are going to do what's good for their employees, right?
That was a requirement under a special exception process.
But back to the question I asked, if we don't employ a blanket approach, and there are some, employers or property managers, are there property managers or employers who use this program basically as an arm of their own human resources department?
Sure. If I could give you a couple of examples, or one example anyway.
Please.
I believe the employer component, if you repeal the law, is just history. I don't think that lives on, and this provision has nothing to do with
this is what we're trying to figure out, why the blanket approach doesn't
participation.
work.
So the vast majority of what you've heard about with confusion is gone, independent of how you deal with this one topic, which is related to property development. We have one example that I'm personally aware of is Federal Realty at Pike and Rose, where their transportation demand management program was essential to the property functioning effectively, because the parking availability is insufficient to meet all of the needs of everybody who lives and works at that development and goes there for retail reasons. So controlling their non-auto driver mode share and balancing their parking requirements was integral to the successful operation of that property that embeds, I don't know how many employers, probably 30 or 40 different employers that are participating through that umbrella. But there are others also that rely, some of our federal campus partners that perform under these requirements as both a developer and an employer rely on these tools heavily to make those campuses work. So there are many examples around the county of places that use their TDM plan in terms of property ownership as a way to make the properties work effectively. To talk about the specifics of these termination and elimination procedures, Ms. McCartney-Green was completely accurate that many of these agreements are three-party, because there aren't that many under the new law where they were only two-party agreements. Most of those, there's a specific requirement for the transportation demand management or traffic mitigation agreement, because that was an essential component of the development meeting its adequate public facilities requirement. And therefore we would expect, although David Ansbacher is here from the planning department and he could speak to it as well, that without that agreement in place, the planning department / board would look to see some alternate means of meeting the effectiveness of what that agreement was. So we are not because of our own interests, but because of the way these agreements were structured to meet the requirements of a development approval, not supportive of a blanket repeal. I think the Part B here that was identified, which allows somebody to request that their agreement be terminated, is reasonable, but there may be other requirements, not necessarily from DOT, but as part of the development approvals that need to be put into place if that agreement is repealed or eliminated. So again, this has nothing to do with employer plans or residential building plans for the residents. It has to do with plans that were instituted as a requirement of development, either under the transportation mitigation agreements, which don't only appear in this section of code, but also the plans that might have just been required under the law from 2018. And there's, I think, another key distinction is, was the plan put in place to just comply with the law, or was it substantively required for the development? And I think this provision of allowing somebody to request to be relieved if it was just to comply with the law is one thing, but if it was substantively required because they didn't build a right turn lane or the trip generation was otherwise unmanageable in the network, that's a different set of circumstances.
A lot going on here, and I appreciate Councilmember Stewart mentioning earlier the Infrastructure Review Committee, where some of this should be on the table. I presume it would be. Mr. Ansbacher, I'm going to ask you to hold for 1 second. I know Councilmember Balcom has some comments.
So yes, I did want to pull out that the employer plans will just, if the repeal goes through, the employer plans are just null and void. The planning board doesn't, it's not a third-party agreement. It's just they submit the plan, and there actually is no requirement in the plan. It's just that they have to submit the plan as it is. So the plans go away from that perspective. So this really does just look at the building owner developer plans. And I think what Director Conklin just mentioned is an important distinction, that some of the plans are part of the APFO requirements. Some are just a matter of ticking the box of we submitted the plans. I think the underlying question right now is twofold. One is if these plans were part of a conditional approval in lieu of building something that the planning board would want that plan to remain in place, because it was a contract that the developer made with planning to say we will do X, Y, and Z instead of ABC. But that's where this the termination request goes into the planning board, and they determine that it can't, they're not going to release it. They're not going to release the lien because it's a requirement it's a condition of improvement. That's one aspect. Then the other aspect is, moving forward, I want to make sure that if there is the full repeal with this language, that the planning board, that the option is still available for developers to say, we can do transportation management and do XYZ and not ABC, and that is still allowed. And the question remains, which I don't know if we have an answer to in the last hour, but whether legislation is required to do that. So much of what we talked about, all the information that we talked about with interfacing with the employers, talking with developers, all of that is still allowed without the law. Mm-hmm. We need to confirm whether that using TDM plans as a conditional of approval would still be allowed under the law.
Mr. Ansbacher.
David Ansbacher, Chief of the Transportation Planning Division at Montgomery Planning. So yes, just to confirm, TMAGs are, going back to TMAGs are, and TDM plans are conditions of approval. So modifying them could trigger an amendment to a preliminary plan. And if there's an APF component of that, that could mean that we need to require property owners, the affected parties, to update their transportation impact study. Those have a cost. It's not a small cost. And as part of that, they could be required to reduce their trips. They could be required to put in the constructed improvements, perhaps that 10 or 20 years ago they weren't required to do. So from our perspective, there's a value in retaining these. Looking forward, the department through Chapter 50 of the County Code can do TMAGs. That's still in the code, and there's a value to that. Yes, we would. We do, again, see a value in allowing applicants to reduce their trips through transportation demand management. The way to enforce that is, as I understand it, through the TMAGs. TMAGs are recorded in the land records, and so there's the ability to enforce them. So if we are retaining the ability, if applicants are retaining the ability to reduce their trips through transportation demand management, the mechanism that we have is the TMAG in the code, and again, it does allow for enforcement.
So let's dive into the TMAGs real quick. Explain what a TMAG is.
TMAG is a three-party agreement between the Planning Department, the Department of Transportation, and the affected property owner that allows us, again, to enforce different transportation demand management requirements.
So let's go deeper than that, right? Yeah. Because if someone wants to develop a property, they, as we're understanding now, depending on that location, they would be required to produce a TMAG, or that's the agreement that they would subscribe to. And then in that, what happens next? Trying to figure out the different layers here, because I'll make the supposition, I'll bring the supposition up first. If it is to increase public transit and to have bus stops and to have different road structures and structured parking, those are all things that partly come with the development itself and partly come within other aspects of our budget, like public transportation budget and the ride-on budget. And so just trying to, again, figure out how these things fit together.
Yeah, if I can offer a little bit of explanation. So the terminology changed in 2018 with the adoption of the new code. So TMAGs were everything that existed before then. TDM plans, everything existed after that. The intentions of them the same, the structure is different. The TDM plans are not three-party agreements, they're two-party agreements. The TMAGs are three-party agreements. And there are still TMAGs being executed as of this year that are from older development applications because they were conditions of approval. Many of the TMAGs are, as Councilmember Balcom described, A, B, C, or D, E, F. Most of them are A, B, C, and D, E, F. So they're not necessarily one-to-one substitutions of doing the things in the TMAG got you out of doing something else, but they may have dropped the overall trip generation so that you didn't have to do something, you didn't have to do G, but A, B, and C you still had to do. So it's not a one-for-one substitution. TMAGs, I think, are required or were required in the transportation management districts. And part of that was that the overall structure of the district was supposed to be supportive of non-auto driving. Therefore, the TMAG required the developer to participate in the programs to ensure that their development performed in the nature that the district was supposed to perform, that they weren't a 100% auto driving unit within a 50% auto driving area. It didn't necessarily relate to specific infrastructure investment, although things like bike share and other investments that support non-auto programs could have been embedded in the TMAG. In areas outside the transportation management districts, there could be voluntary traffic mitigation agreements that are more specifically, I did this because I didn't want to do some built improvement. They go back to the 80s, I think, in terms of their structures. And they are all relied upon by the department in its comments and by the planning board in its review of the conditions for the approval. So they're a very different animal. And then the TDM plans, I think, are the area that's more complicated because they may have also been relied upon by the planning board as a condition of approval, but aren't in agreement that's also with the planning.
Well, if
commission.
something is even more complicated than what we're discussing, then we will have another work session on this.
Can I just clarify
yeah.
one point? The TDM plans, though, are simplified from what we used to have in the traffic mitigation agreements or the TMACs. They're much simpler.
And I want to be mindful of the time and recognizing that this will not be settled today, clearly, but honing in on the TMAG. So if we cannot have a blanket policy because of long-established TMAGs, Director Conklin, you noted that there are some TMAGs, TMAG agreements, I guess is redundancy, but TMAGs that are still being implemented and worked through, and there are requirements and reporting. Can you explain that a little bit more? Like what are we talking, again,
Sure,
trying
so-
to drill down to what the practical
So
reality of
the
these are.
requirement for a transportation mitigation agreement was usually at the preliminary plan of subdivision. And there's a long road between the approval of that plan and the development being operational. And oftentimes, there'll be some allowance for the TMAG not to be executed up to the point where occupancy is imminent for the development. So you may have a period or 10 or so or more years between when the requirement for a mitigation agreement was defined in the approval conditions and when that agreement becomes in force because there's something there and people there that are going to comply with the agreement. So, we changed this law in 2018. I haven't seen one for signature in the last 9 to 12 months, but they have been signed up until very recently in the old form. And in the new form, there have been 7 or so that have made their way through.
Thank you. Just a couple questions. So the I guess the question is, if the repeal bill goes through, can the streamlined TDM plans still be used similar to the voluntary TMAGs that were used outside of the TMDs?
Are you asking if we can use the streamlined form or template of our TDM plans to replace existing TMAGs?
No. I'm talking about in the future. So in the future, if there isn't a requirement for a TMD plan, can the planning board still offer that to a developer as a conditional approval similar to when a voluntary TMAG was used?
We could certainly include conditions of approval that speak to the elements that are in a TDM plan.
Mm-hmm.
I think I'd need more legal counsel to know how to answer that question. I think notionally that makes sense, that you could require a certain level of trip reduction and implementation of TDM measures as part of a condition of approval, what form that would take without the code. Because the code is kind of specific about how it's laid out. I think we'd have to spend a little bit more time on to give you a solid answer.
Mm-hmm. Okay, and then the other point was the language on page 7, the termination request, because it's a termination request and not a termination guarantee, the planning board would still be able to make that distinction between whether you would approve that termination or not, correct?
Right. The planning board would have to make the determination.
Right.
And as I said earlier, could require the applicants to redo their study.
Right. And then it would be up to the applicant to say, I'm good, I'm going to hold, we're going to just continue.
That would be up
Okay.
to the applicant.
Okay, thank you.
So, Councilmember Malcolm, the only one that doesn't fit into that bucket are these TDM plans that were approved since 2018, since the new law.
So thank you. I was going to ask that question too. So who are the two parties? Is it?
The Department of Transportation and the developer.
Okay.
In
So
those.
if it was used, if it was a conditional use, conditional approval, would So would you consult with the planning department on?
Perhaps the mechanics are the same, that we would still want to see the planning department's concurrence, even though they're not a signatory.
Sure,
we
because
agree
it could be that was in lieu of built improvement.
Right, and we make recommendations, the department makes recommendations during the whole development review process. So not just about this, about many, many things, and that would be one of them.
Thank you.
So I'm going to hit pause so that we can digest the conversation. Appreciate the comments that were just made as another way to try and figure out this complex puzzle. But ultimately, what Councilmember Balcom just noted as well is, again, a shared goal that all of us have, just trying to figure out how else we can accomplish that without the carrot stick punitive measure, detailed TDMs, TMAGs, all of this, which is very complicated, but again, the goal is important. So, Ms. McCartney Green, we got homework to do, and so let's put a pause on this right now. We'll have lots of offline conversations, look into not only the code as it exists, but also how planning operates, and if there's another aspect that needs to be brought in to make sure that as future development, as already approved development continues, if there's any changes that are needed there too. Is that right?
Chair Glass just wanted to just reiterate that this is the uncodified part, so it's instructional, and so however, if this phrase or language is not, amendable to the committee, we can think about that differently as well.
I'll turn it to Councilmember Balcom for the final word.
Thank you. So as complicated as this discussion is, the existing law and regs are even more complicated. And so I think that, the bottom line, I think there's a lot of agreement between the intent of the repeal and moving forward some of the issues, some of the aspects of the TDM plan. We need to repeal. We need to look at what we're going to do with these. I think for me, the outstanding issue is I want to make sure that the agreements that developers made with the planning board, they got their approvals for their development based on the deal that they made with the planning board. We need to make sure that that's in place. But going forward, we also need to make sure that we have the flexibility, that developers have the flexibility to continue to do this. And I just, again, want to underscore that the goals of transportation demand management remain in place to reduce single occupancy vehicles. And the activity that the county does, that DOT does, it can still remain. I agree that there might need to be more carrot versus stick for eliminating the stick. But I do think that from a market perspective, employers want to provide this benefit to their employees, and people want to learn about it. And so I think that while we're not there yet, I think we're all understanding where we need to get to. So thank you.
Okay, good conversation to be continued. And with that, we're adjourned. Thank you.